Good afternoon and welcome to today's Knowledge Exchange Seminar. I'm delighted that today's seminar is focusing on the issue of housing, in particular on the standard of available housing, both in the social sector and the private rented sector. It is important that we learn from international best practice and that we find best balance between providing adequate housing for those most vulnerable in our society and providing adequate funding. As a devolved assembly, we are always engaged in the process of fine-tuning our administration to ensure that we have the systems, structures and policies that best suit our needs. This is where the work of academics like those present today is invaluable. They help us consider what works and what does not. This information helps us develop better services and better mechanisms for delivering them. Today's presentations point to the growing recognition that there are problems within our social housing. They touch on the issues considered by the committee in its scrutiny of the department's social housing reform programme. The committee's scrutiny aims to improve housing structures, making the system financially sustainable for tenants and the executive, ensure delivery of well-maintained housing stock and increased investment in social housing more generally, improve the focus on strategy and regional delivery of services, and create space and freedom for social landlords to play a more proactive and innovative role in the communities they serve. The focus of this work is to stabilise the management of Northern Ireland's housing stock at a time when Northern Ireland's demography is continuing to change. Between 2001 and 2011, our population rose by 7.5% to 1.8 million. Our age profile is becoming older and the average household size has continued to fall, but the number of households is continuing to rise. In its Northern Ireland Housing Market Review for 2014 to 2017, the Housing Executive estimates that there's an annual requirement for at least 1,200 additional new social dwellings required to meet ongoing need. However, the Housing Estimate estimates that a minimum of 2,000 new social dwellings are needed each year to make inroads into the underinvestment of previous years and to make up for the low rates of new private construction. In addition to this, decreased government budgets and the changes to welfare create an impetus to develop a new strategic way forward. In 2013, the Department of Social Development published its analysis of the impact of proposed welfare reforms and found that the reforms could be expected to have major effects on social tenants. The Northern Ireland Housing Conditions Survey suggested that about 46% of working age tenants in Northern Ireland will experience a reduction in housing benefit due to under-occupation, while in England and Scotland the comparable figure is estimated at 20%. And political parties are working as we speak to try to mitigate against the worst excesses of welfare reform and protect the most vulnerable across the north, which would include the bedroom tax. The failure of social housing keeping pace with demand over the last decade has led to a major growth in the private rented sector. With that comes a new set of challenges for oversight and control to ensure protection for those tenants who are vulnerable. These are the issues that the Committee for Social Development, the Department and the wider sector have to consider. The future roles of the Housing Executive and the housing associations are currently under consideration, as is the affordability of social housing. In our two presentations today, we will hear that the academics can add to these debates. In the first presentation, Lindsay Shaw of the School of Built Environment at the Ulster University will discuss the adequacy of our current minimum housing standard. Lindsay will compare our system to a housing standard system used in England and Wales. She will outline some arguments for a change to this system, including cost implications. Our second presentation, from a team of researchers from Ulster, Queen's and Nottingham universities, will discuss their work on budget analysis applied to housing in Northern Ireland. Professor O'Connell, Mr Rooney and Professors Harvey and Nolan have carried out a major piece of work examining how international human rights principles could be embedded in budgeting practices. Today they will highlight how they have applied these principles to the fields of social housing and mental health, outlining examples of good practice and lessons learned for housing in Northern Ireland. I now hand you over to Lindsay for her presentation, and I wish to you as well in your proceedings today. Thank you very much.
My name is Lindsay Shaw. I'm a lecturer in environmental health at the School of the Built Environment at Ulster University. And before I started in Ulster University, I was an environmental health officer for about 13 years, so I have that practical experience as well. And it was my keen interest that I had in housing, and that was founded whenever I was working as an environmental health officer. And environmental health are on the coal face of housing, and they're more known for, on the ground, of doing a lot of inspections and ensuring that standards are maintained, particularly in the private rented sector. And that's where I'm going to be focusing on. Okay, so why do we need a change? And one reason is the growth of the private rented sector. And the Northern Ireland House Condition Surveys that are carried out on a regular basis provide most of this information. And you can see that from 2001 to 2011, whenever the last House Condition Survey was carried out, there's been a huge growth in the private rented sector, from 7.6% to now 16.5%. And overall in that 10 years, that equates to about 117% rise in the private rented sector. It's more than doubled. And to put that into context as well, and how this fits with the rest of housing, social housing, the housing executive now equates for 11.3% of the housing stock, and housing associations are 3.3%, which is the total. So social housing in total is 14.6%. So the private rented sector is now bigger than social housing, okay, but it's an area that doesn't get as much attention. So that is a really important issue to deal with. And let's have a look then at what is happening in the private rented sector as well. Key findings find that 16.5% of housing stock is in the private rented sector, with 18% of households. So it's nearly a fifth of people living in the private rented sector. The household type with the highest proportion renting privately are households with children. So we've got very vulnerable people depending on this sector, and that is an important issue. A higher than average proportion, 33% of households, reference person who are not working lived in the private rented sector. So we're dealing with households with limited income, poor and limited income. And the private rented sector continues to show an increase in lower income households from 2009, and 23% of private rented households an annual income of less than £10,000. So we do have families, households with very limited incomes, and that this really shows the importance of the private rented sector now in housing these types of households. Okay, and so there's an increasing role in the private rented sector, and this increasing role has been recognised by quite a number of people for many years now. Even back in 2002, Julie Ruggs and others at Warwick University, they summarised a number of demand groups in the private rented sector. They said there's a number of different groups that use the private rented sector, and they also recognised that there was these what they call residual users. And these are namely households in low incomes and traditionally been housed in the social sector. Professor Paddy Gray and Ursula McNulty from Ulster University in 2008 looked specifically at Northern Ireland, and they said that the private rented sector are increasingly have a larger number of residual users, so those that have been traditionally housed in the social rented sector. And they said that the increased role in the private rent sector is playing in providing and managing social housing. So they're saying that the private rented sector is an awful lot more, an awful bigger role now. Peter Kemp in 2011 in England showed that the private rented sector plays a disproportionately important role in accommodating households living in poverty, and he argued that the odds of being income poor are the same for private tenants as they are for social housing tenants. The DSD themselves, in Building Sound Foundations, which is a strategy for the private rented sector published in 2010, also signalled the intention to scope and address the needs of the most vulnerable individuals and families in securing sustainable private sector tenancies. Leading on from that, the Chartered Institute of Housing, along with the Department of Social Development and Smart Move in 2011, published a document with the aim to raise awareness of the sector as a valuable housing option and to explore the opportunities for partnership approaches to meeting housing needs throughout the sector. So again, it's this increased role of the private rented sector, taking in the gap of where social housing was. The Independent Commission on the Future of Housing in Northern Ireland in 2010, otherwise known as the BEST report, also said that there needs to be an involvement of a wider range of providers, including the private rented sector, for more flexible tenure options so that social housing can offer greater choice, address changing household circumstances and support housing aspirations. The DSD's Housing Strategy, Facing the Future 2012, also recognised the private rented sector should offer a viable alternative for more households. And then most recently and more up to date, the research to inform a fundamental review of social housing allocations policy, which was led again by Professor Paddy Gray at Ulster University, indicated that a housing options service model could be introduced in Northern Ireland for housing allocation. And this model, this housing options model, helps individuals make positive, informed choices about their future home, whilst also helping to manage expectations of their likelihood of being housed with the social rented sector. Okay, so it's this recognition, so we don't have enough social rented houses anymore. So these families that traditionally have used them have to then have to live somewhere, and the alternative is a good and strong private rented sector. Okay, so there's definitely a gap in the private rented sector is filling that. So let's take a look at the actual conditions within the private rented sector. Unfitness levels are highest in the private rented sector, 7.1%, compared to 0.4% in social housing. Okay, and to me then there's a disparity. I mean, like these low income households who would normally have been housed in the social rented sector will not be able to access those housing. Okay, so they have to go to the private rented sector, and they're not getting this to live in the same conditions and have the same protection that those in the social rented sector do. Okay, levels of disrepair are similar in both the private rented sector and the social rented sector, but higher than owner-occupied sectors. However, whenever they were asked, only 21% of privately rented dwellings had reported to have been repaired or improved in the last 5 years, compared to 49% in the social housing, which indicates that there's an issue of getting repairs done in the private rented sector compared to the social rented sector. Okay, and again, when it comes to the decent home standard, the private rented sector also fares worse than the social rented sector. So again, it shows that disparity between living in the social rented sector and living in the private rented sector. 49.1% of homes in the private rented sector were in fuel poverty. Okay, and that again is much higher than the social rented sector and higher than the owner-occupied sector. And private rented homes were more likely than social housing or owner-occupied homes to be overcrowded, which again is another issue and one that I've started to look at as well. Okay, so these statistics indicate the conditions within the private rented sector are least favourable, okay, of all the housing sectors. And this is significant as the private rented sector is increasingly housing low-income households who may already be disadvantaged. Okay, Building Sound Foundation Strategy and Facing the Future Housing Strategy both make reference to the need for the review of the current minimum standard for housing. Okay, and it's necessary in order to offer protection for occupants and reduce inequalities between housing sectors, especially to these low-income households that traditionally were homed within the social rented sector, but now increasingly residual users of the private rented sector. So what is this fitness standard? Because that's our statutory minimum standard for housing. So what does this fitness standard actually say? The minimum standard for housing is currently the fitness standards outlined in the Housing Northern Ireland 1992. It has its foundations whenever it was introduced by the Ministry of Health in 1911 and has been recognised to have continued in in very much the same format, since then. However, there has been updates, and said the last one was in 1992. And I find whenever I'm teaching housing at the university, I'm now speaking to students and teaching them about housing standards, and housing standards older than my students. Okay, so it shows you that such a time period has, and such a generation gap has been let to go. Also, there's a pass-fail or unfit-fit model. Okay, so there's no discrepancy between a house that's just about failed and one that was grossly, grossly unfit. Okay, and I think an analogy I use is like whenever you do an exam, you do a bit of coursework, you sort of like to know, well, have I just passed that, or have I done really well? And we like to know, did we get a first-class degree, or did we get a third? Okay, there's a big difference there. Okay, and there's some things that are not taken into account by fitness, which are really important. And the first one is thermal comfort. Okay, fitness standard talks about adequate heating. Okay, but the guidance for that says that adequate heating is a fixed appliance in a living room, which could actually be a bar heater. Okay, and a plug in any other room. Now, there's not that many houses left with that, because most, markets drive up the standards as well. But if an environmental health officer comes across a house like that, there's nothing they can do to make the landlord make any changes. Okay, so that's what we have for thermal comfort. It doesn't take into account much insulation. The guidance talks about, it doesn't have to reach modern 1992 standards. And you can imagine there's been a lot of changes since 1992 when it comes to thermal insulation. Okay, safety. The fitness standard says nothing about safety in and around the home. Okay, so we're dealing a lot with inherently dangerous steps, for example. And I can remember going to a house, and it was an old canal house, and there was a path about that there thick between the edge of the house and then the drop in the canal, and there was no fence. And the tenants wanted some work done to it, and I had to tell them I cannot make the landlord do anything on that. And they had children, and they were concerned that their children were going to fall down into the canal. Fire safety is something as well that environmental health officers are often asked about, and the escape from fire, and that's not taken into account in the fitness standard. Okay, and hopefully you'll be able to see that. That is an example of conditions that will come across by environmental health officers. This is a house actually, and this photographs are provided by Newton Abbey Borough Council, so it's not that far from where we are today. And as you can see, it's a very steep set of steps, and it comes to a very abrupt end with the wall. So while coming down there, I think everyone would agree there's an accident waiting to happen. Okay, but whenever officers are going to inspect that house, if there was nothing else wrong with that house, they would have to say that house is suitable to live in, and they would not be able to make the landlord do anything about that. So there's huge issues with the fitness standard, but I think everyone in the sector realises that. Okay, and over in England, they did recognise this quite a while ago, and they introduced, back in 2005, they introduced the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, and it was replaced in 2005, and that's 10 years ago, so we're already 10 years behind England and Wales. It's an evidence-based, they did a lot of research and gathering up the statistics on this, and it's also a risk-assessed tool, okay, which brings it in line with a lot of other environmental health and enforcement type work. Health and safety is based on risk assessment. Food safety is based on risk assessment. So why shouldn't housing and housing safety be based on a risk assessment? It considers the effect of the deficiency, not just the presence of a defect. And deficiency means it does not meet the ideal. Okay? Whereas a defect, something has to be there and defective. Those set of stairs, if that timber is sound, it's not defective. It's just badly put in. Okay. It can adapt to research, to development and research, and can be informed by local circumstances. And I'll give you examples for that in a wee minute. But I think what scares a lot of people off is we've changed from a 9-point standard in fitness now to a 29-point standard in housing health and safety rating system. But it's not as scary as all that. Okay. We have our old favourites, back with us. We have damp and mould growth, and we have structural collapse, which would tie in with structural stability. Okay, but then we have a lot of new hazards that were never assessed before, and things like falling on stairs, falling between levels, radiation, noise, entry by intruders. And whenever I said just previously in the other slide about ongoing research, in 2005 it's actually recognised that they underestimated the effects of carbon monoxide. But because there has been new research, you can actually change the assessment from that based on that new research. Okay. Whenever it comes about local circumstances, entry by intruders is another good one. And for an example, I did an assessment in my own house. Okay. I looked up NINIS, which is the neighbourhood statistics, and I was able to discover that my house is an area of high burglary rate. So I was able to use that information as a local circumstance to make an assessment on my own house. So I was a wee bit perturbed by that, the fact that I could be robbed. Okay, so there's lots of different things, but you don't assess them all. I mean, like for example, you'll not be assessing every house for radiation. You'll only be assessing those houses that are living in high radon areas. Places like the Mournes and certain areas of Strabane. You'll not be you'll not be assessing every house for noise. You'll only maybe be assessing them on properties that are very close to maybe very busy roads. Okay, so you'll only be assessing those hazards which have come to head whenever you start doing the inspection. Okay, and whenever it comes to actual work of the environmental health officers, what they're doing is that they rate the hazard, and any category 1 hazards, that's where the enforcement side of environmental health is concentrated on, and that mainly is in the private rented sector. This tenure does owner-occupiers, social rented and privately rented sector, but enforcement is focused on the private rented sector. Okay, so okay, but there is major links with other policies and other strategies, and one, as an example, is fuel poverty. Housing health and safety rating system links very closely with fuel poverty. Okay, and in Northern Ireland it's recognised that we have high levels of fuel poverty, and there's a number of different reasons for that, but one way of trying to improve that is by improving the housing conditions. Properties with poor thermal insulation, heating type, poor efficiency, and the age of house, the older houses, they're already recognised to be at risk. Households living in those type of houses are at risk of being in fuel poverty. Housing health and safety rating system assesses all those whenever they're making a judgment whenever it comes to thermal comfort. Okay, so the two go hand in hand. Okay. Before I leave that about fuel poverty, the DSD is doing a lot of good work with affordable warmth and warm home scheme, and indeed Professor Christine Liddell led a seminar just a few weeks ago on affordable warmth in the private rented sector. And along with that work, if the housing health and safety rating system was introduced, it would complement all that other work that is going on to try and reduce fuel poverty. The next issue I wanted to address was home accidents, and again I used NINIS and looking at Northern Ireland hospital admissions, and 23% of accidents that are going to hospital admissions occurred in the home, and this is compared to 11% of accidents from road traffic collisions. So double the amount of people are being hurt in their own homes than on the road. We all know the huge campaigns, and quite rightly there is those campaigns for road accidents, but there's an awful lot more people being injured in their own homes. Okay, and whenever you break it down to age groups, you can see from here that the 0 to 4 years, so children, and over 65s, okay, the elderly, are disproportionately more affected by accidents and going to hospitals than any other age group. Okay, so that is something that is really important because this is, again, we've already said that quite a large number of households using the private rented sector have got children in them. Okay, and what type of hazards are there in a home? And this relates very clearly to home accident prevention as well. Excess cold is seen to be the most common hazard in people's homes, and that's no surprise. But the next three most common hazards in homes are falls. Falls on the stairs, falls in the level, and falls between levels. Okay? And if you read the home accident prevention strategy, falls is a major issue there as well. Okay? So the two go hand in hand. Okay, and this is a very long, a busy slide, as they would like to call it, and I'm not going to read it out. But why I put this in is the home accident prevention strategy was just launched at the beginning of this week, and it's a really good piece of work. Okay, and it recognises that falls in the home is a major issue. Okay, and whenever I read this paragraph, I was like, do you know something? If I hadn't known, I could have been easily reading the Housing Health and Safety Rating System operating guidelines, because it's using similar language, similar research, similar outcomes. Okay, so I thought the two very nicely go hand in hand. And in fact, there was a number, and whenever they had a consultation on the home accident prevention strategy, there was a number of responses highlighting Housing Health and Safety Rating System as a way of improving home safety and preventing a lot of home accidents as well. Like, we're not saying that every accident in the home is going to be resolved by using the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, because some people will be tripping over mats that have been put down wrongly, but it's to deal with those inherent problems, like those steps that I showed you earlier before. As I said, that they're just an accident waiting to happen. Okay. Whenever we come to actual costs, and let's face it, money talks, doesn't it? Okay. The BRE have done a lot of research that, and they actually used Housing Health and Safety Rating System as a tool for showing the cost to the NHS and cost to society, because it was flexible that they could actually do that, and detailed enough. Fitness Standard doesn't have the detail there. Housing Health and Safety Rating System does. And they reckoned that the cost of the NHS of treating ill health resulting from poor housing to be £2.4 billion per year. And this compares to an estimated cost of treating smoking-related issues of £400 million per year. So it far outweighs that. And again, we've seen the very good work that's being done on tobacco control. But a lot of ill health is caused by people living in their own homes. The full cost to society of living in poor housing is estimated to be some £82 million per year, and an additional £33 million per year is estimated to be saved in the first year of treatment costs of the NHS if hazards were reduced to a more acceptable level. Okay, and some of these hazards are not expensive to remedy. Okay, around 25%, around a quarter of all Category 1 hazards can be made acceptable with a cost of less than £600. Some of it is only even £10 would actually really help. Okay, it doesn't have to be a lot, and the average cost for making Category 1 hazard acceptable is £3,710. And a lot of those big costs are actually things like increasing, thermal comfort, which we do want to do because we want to reduce fuel poverty as well, and that's where the big costs lie, not on things like falls on the stairs. Okay. And going back to my wee picture there, the BRE also did specific research in Northern Ireland, and they found that it falls associated with stairs and steps. The number of dwellings in Northern Ireland is affected would be about nearly 56,000. Okay, the average cost per dwelling to repair them is £1,271. The savings to the NHS, if they fixed it, would be near enough 14 million, and the payback to the NHS is about 5.1 years. Okay, so those figures are huge and speak for themselves. And there's a range of examples where Housing Health and Safety Rating System have been used in a wider public health context. Okay, an example that's often quoted is Liverpool Healthy Homes programme. And it tackles health inequalities through reaching out into priority communities, engaging with residents and improving housing conditions and access to health and wellbeing related organisations. And you know, we have some really good work in Northern Ireland. I mean, Neighbourhood Renewal has been a fantastic success, and they've been doing something similar, but they haven't got all the links and all the tools that are really available to them, especially whenever it comes to housing. Liverpool Healthy Homes identified areas for intervention based on things like income deprivation, health deprivation, living environment, numbers in the private rented sector, Category 1 hazards as identified by the English House Condition Survey, emergency hospital admissions and hospital admissions for falls. So they were really targeting the most needy here. And there was lots of help out there. It wasn't just a housing initiative. There was lots of other help and signposting made available. But one thing that they did do was if a Category 1 hazard was thought of, they would send an environmental health officer in to make that assessment. And these are houses mainly in the private rented sector where the environmental health officer could take enforcement action on the landlord to do the repair works. Progress and findings. This was in the first year of the programme. There was 24,000 assessments and there was about nearly 4,000 housing inspections carried out and 2,700 Category 1 hazards identified and removed. The estimated savings to the NHS was nearly £500,000 per year based on the housing improvements made in year one of the programme. And if these savings were sustained, that would equate to 4.4 million over 10 years. The wider benefits to society was estimated to be 11 million over those 10 years. Really substantial amounts of money here. And the programme delivery should deliver 5 times the number of house inspections undertaken in year one. So savings to the Healthy Homes programme could be 55 million over 10 years. And in addition to that, which is a wee spin-off as well, there was £4 million investment by the private rented sector landlords as a result of enforcement work that was deemed necessary. In other words, they had to go and fix things. Okay? And on the basis that there are approximately 3 employees for every £100,000 spent on construction, at least 30 construction jobs were thought to have been created. Okay? So it really does have knock-on impacts, not just about improving one person's home. There's quite a substantial knock-on improvements or knock-on effects there. Support for the NHS, HHSRS. There is quite a range of support already out there for the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. One is the Chartered Institute of Housing, who said in 2009 the adoption of the Housing Health and Safety Rating System as a replacement to fitness standards by local councils would enhance fitness standards and the health and social well-being of tenants right across the private rented sector. The Chartered Institute of Environmental Health and the Chief Environmental Health Officers Group, you know, being in the environmental health family, are very much in support of the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. The Housing Rights Service actually produced a policy briefing in 2014 whenever the Department of Social Development announced that they were going to review the minimum standard for housing. And their policy briefing stated that the current review being undertaken by the Department of Social Development offers a unique opportunity to improve the current housing fitness standard with the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, which operates in other parts of the UK. The Housing Health and Safety Rating System is much better suited not only to address unfitness and disrepair issues in properties, but also has a direct link to enhancing the well-being of its occupants. Okay. NILGA have also made comments supporting the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. So has the Independent Commission on the Future of Housing in Northern Ireland. That best report where they said we should adopt something like the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. And as I just have said, the Department of Social Development are currently doing a review, and they've got a team carrying out this review at the minute, and the report is expected soon. And they've done, from what I can see, they've done a fantastic job of it so far, because they They've been very thorough and they have engaged a lot of stakeholders. So I'm really looking forward to seeing their report, and then from that report we can see a consultation coming from that. And whenever I was thinking about recommendations for any future minimum housing standard for housing in Northern Ireland, these were the sort of things that I was thinking of. That there should be an evidence base to any new system, and I think that's true of anything. Anything that we're introducing now, there should be evidence for it. Okay, and there's very much a lot of evidence directing towards housing health and safety rating system. Any system should be able to incorporate meaningful measurement of progress, okay, and that would be the number of properties with Category 1 hazards, those worst hazards that are there. Any system should be able to incorporate meaningful measurement of cost to society of poor housing. You know, we need to measure the cost and how much savings that we have, and I think that is very true about a lot of things that are being introduced now. It's all about how much is this going to cost, how much is this going to save, because it's the savings that's important. Any system should be sustainable and allow change in circumstances. I mean, that's the problem with the fitness standard. In 1992, it was like, oh, this is great, but it got stuck in 1992. Okay, we don't need a system like that. We need one that we can continually change. And there should be a system to be able to make comparisons with the housing stock in other areas of UK. That's going to be really important if you're going to argue we need more investment. We need something to compare it to. Okay, so we need a system to be able to compare it to with. It should be beneficial to introduce a system that has been proven to work. And the housing health and safety rating system has been operating now in 10 years. In England and Wales, and it's been doing that successfully for 10 years. There's now a lot of legal precedent being set, which makes any areas that were a wee bit grey, they're making it clear, okay? And it has been shown to work. One of the very few criticisms that I've seen about the housing health and safety rating system is that environmental health departments aren't actually resourced properly to allow the officers to get the most out of it. Okay, so that's one of the biggest criticisms. Okay, and in fact, in the United States, they've actually adopted the housing health and safety rating system as well, so it's operating in the United States too. And there should be potential for a wider scope and use. And I give Liverpool Healthy Homes as an example, but we could easily put it into programmes and strategies here. And we've seen, you know, the connections with fuel poverty and seen the connections with home accident prevention. And there should be support for the new system. And I've said who all has given support. And in conclusion, I would just like to say that, you know, there is this increased role for the private rented sector in providing housing solutions. Okay, we cannot rely on an ever-shrinking social rented sector. And that means there's an increased number of vulnerable people living in the private rented sector. And there needs to be a standard that will offer adequate protection and equity for those households. And then, you know, because the Department of Social Development are doing this review, it is a rare opportunity, and it's one that I think is important to everyone in society. So that's it. Thank you very much.